Hello, everybody, and welcome back to the final session of this year's conference. So I can't believe we're already at the final session, but we've still got one more fascinating discussion lined up for you. And following that, a reminder to everyone, after the end of this session, we are going to be having our conclusions session, our summary session. It's a wrap. Which is hosted by Aware. We're going to be hearing from Aware actually in this session now. But following that, we are going to be having the conclusions from some of our event speakers, giving you guys a chance out there to also give us what your final thoughts are on the event, and finishing things off with a chance to have some live music with the band The Sweet Beats, who are going to be joining us and playing live to close things for the conference. But first of all, we've got this last session. So in the last session, on the previous session, I should say, we focused on the coverage targets and looking at what can be done to reach those coverage targets. We're now going to switch and look more at the capacity issues. So looking at delivering densification and what can be done to improve situations and maybe streamline things in that area. So we have an excellent lineup of panelists with us once again. And to introduce those and tell us more, I'd like to now welcome to the stage Andy Hudson from Sytena. So Andy, welcome, and great to have you with us. And yeah, as I said, really looking forward to this session. So it's a key issue, and I think a nice contrast to the rural areas that we were looking at in the last session. So looking forward to it. So I will pass over to you.
Thanks, Dan. As always, it's an absolute pleasure. So we've been talking about small cells for a long time, and it's not unique to 5G. So some of the things we're going to cover are actually ongoing discussions that many of us will remember from other conferences too. Adding capacity and higher performance in dense urban areas really means that we're going to have to get more cells. And that small cell adoption has actually been quite slow in Europe, certainly compared to the US, where things are starting to move quicker. So we wanted to pull together this session to think about why that might be. So it might be that it's really hard to get small cells sited, red tape, bureaucracy, difficult processes. It might be that the business case just doesn't stack up. It might also be that operators are just concentrating on other things. So maybe they're worrying at the minute about rolling out 3.5 to their macro towers. Maybe they're worried about vendor swap out, etc. So is it just a focus area? Maybe it's that sharing makes sense, but it's very hard to make sharing work with small cells compared to macros. So these are some of the issues that we're going to pick through. And we really want to be thinking about what can or should we be doing as Europe to facilitate this and make it easier. Now, we like to give you value for money, so we don't want to give you only one perspective. So we've got 4 perspectives that we're going to bring to this discussion. We've got a regulatory one. We've got a technology-specific one. We've got one from an equipment vendor. And finally, we've got a tower co to give a perspective of people who are actually rolling out these things. So if I go through the panel that we've got, and thanks to all of them, we start off with Gilles Bregon, who's the Director General of ANFR. And he's going to be talking a little bit about the current situation, some of the concerns maybe, some views on small cells and verticals. And I'm hoping at some stage during the discussion, we might be able to push him a little bit about Paris and the Olympics, which is something I've heard might be happening. We then got Sergei Figola, who is the Chief Technology Officer at the I2CAP Foundation. He's going to be giving us a 5G and technology perspective. So this is a research center. He's going to be talking a little bit about promoting usage of 5G use cases and particularly learning about the urban deployment model that is being used. So we then transfer over to Ericsson, so as an equipment vendor. Hans Hammer is who's the head of radio for Europe and Latin America. Interesting mix there. I'm interested to find out more about how that combination of Europe and Latin America works. But he's going to be telling us a little bit about the Ericsson model. There's a very famous slide that many of us know about improve, densify, and add. And he's going to be explaining that and helping us to think about how people view this kind of rollout and the trade-offs. Talking a little bit about the total cost of ownership, And then we might get him to talk a little bit later on, if you help me with this with some good questions, about the importance of fibre in this rollout as well. So not to think of it in isolation from some of the other policies. And finally, we've got Victor Dott, who's the head of small cell business lines in Cellnex. So he's going to give us a tower code perspective, a little bit more on the sort of TCO versus macro, but really that experience in cities. And I think we might be able to get him to say a few things about indoor as well as outdoor. So how we define what we mean by the small cells. So hopefully that's given you a flavour. Encourage you all to ask lots of questions. They get passed on to us. We'd like a really interactive discussion. And these guys have got a lot of knowledge, so let's try and pull it out of them. So without further ado, Gilles, from your perspective, perhaps you would say a few words. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you, Andy. Hello, everybody. So maybe the first slide. Thanks. So 5G is covering now a number of places all around Europe, and of course also in France, due to our 3.5 gigahertz midband, which is very efficient for coverage. But now we're waiting for densification. So we took measures in my spectrum agency early enough, because in 2016 we tested small cells, outdoor small cells, as was envisaged at that time for 5G. So this is not a work of art. This is a small cell fitted on a bus stop in France city, Annecy. And we tried to see what it was producing in terms of EMF, in terms of social acceptability, in terms of network efficiency. What we saw is that we had to keep a sharp eye on social acceptability, because small cells are visible in the city. They are within reach of persons, and people who are against small cells can actually reach them and destroy them. But with good explanations, with good figures, with good data, they are well accepted by the neighborhood. So this testing was very efficient. And then we were ready for the small cells. So next step, next slide, please. So this is a small cell. As you can see, for instance, in the Paris metro, small cells are very unobtrusive indoor. You have small cells today everywhere for 4G, in conference centers, in places like the Tube, in shopping centers. And small cells are efficient, small cells are necessary, and small cells are 4G. But then, of course, it's easy with an indoor small cell to make it 5G. This is what we did. And maybe in the next slide. Next slide shows the Rennes railway station in Brittany. In this railway station, we have equipped it, operators have equipped it with 26 gigahertz millimeter waves, small cells, 5G indoor. This has been tested thoroughly with, of course, EMF measurements, with efficiency, with social acceptability. And in fact, we discovered that implementing small cells indoor is rather easy, because in fact, indoor small cells are unnoticeable, are very efficient, and provide good service. So we're ready now to implement small cells in major stations like in Rennes, and we think that it will be efficient and well accepted by the population. But, and that's the last slide, what will happen when small cells are going to come outside, when they're going to be outdoor small cells? This is a cartoon that was published in the Wall Street Journal, and you see a forest of small cells, American small cells, because the Americans have started 5G with millimeter waves, so they started with small cells. And you have a woodcutter waiting to cut down the small cells. And in fact, when are small cells going to appear in Europe? We see three conditions for an appearance of small cells outdoor in Europe. First, you need to have actual spectrum availability. You need that the regulator will provide small cells, will provide spectrum, and probably millimeter wave spectrum, to the operators to allow them to densify the networks in the cities. And this is not done everywhere. This is not, for the time being, done in France, for instance. then you need massive connection of urban furniture, because if you want to put small cells on street lights, on bus stops, where you can dream of, then you need to bring the fiber here. And bringing this massive backhaul to urban furniture is very expensive. So that's another point that has to be overcome if we want to provide small cells in the city. And third point, we need to work on social acceptability, because small cells are visible in the city because they can be seen on buildings, on streetlights, on urban furniture at large. And that creates some suspicion from the neighborhood. So we need to explain why small cells are useful, why they are efficient, why they're safe. So our advice for small cell introduction in Europe first is transparency. If you plug small cells in the city, you must tell people that you're doing this and why. Then we should probably distinguish between indoor and outdoor. Indoor is easy for small cells. Outdoor is not that easy. So we have to work on small cells outdoor and see when and where they are needed. We need to have a rather slow deployment, not a fast, quick, and brutal deployment as happened in the States, for instance. We need to have something which is progressive. And last point, we need to produce EMF measurements to show that small cells are more efficient in terms of EMF, and that they actually bring contribution to lower the global EMF deployment, because when you have small cells active, then your terminal sends less waves around and on your body. So there are still a number of points that have to be taken in Europe before we actually open up the flow for small cell deployment. Thank you very much. That's over. You can actually stop the presentation. Thanks.
Fantastic. Thank you for that. So some really good points there for us to think about as we go into the discussion. So maybe if we go to Sergey now, and perhaps you can give us that flavor from a 5G research perspective.
Yeah. Hello, Andy. Good afternoon. Okay, let's see. I think that I have a couple of slides. Let's see if they are popped up. Okay, good. So, well, I am planning to give a high-level perspective from the outcomes that we also got from a research project that was called 5G City. So what we saw under this project is that it's quite important to analyze the cities and the places where you want to actually deploy small cells, because you might have different type of shapes, different types of cities, and it might require specific scenarios for each one of them. To do so, one of the things that we analyzed is Barcelona. So with a map actually to identify which is the density of people in the different areas that we selected, and what is the density of businesses to identify what could be also, I would say, the private use of the infrastructure, right? And then I think that Barcelona is an easy example, because most of the streets that we have are similar to those which are on the right figures on the above, the two of the above, which means that everything is symmetric, it's parallel, and it's easy. There is not that much streets as those that can be very, very complex in different cities, where you have a big densification, not only of people, but streets, and then you need antennas. So then the exercise that we did in the project is thinking on the perspective or what should be the impact of a neutral host model. Understanding that at some point, when you have to provide a really dense scenario, it might be complicated for most of the reasons that also Gil has mentioned. In fact, it's not just about the visual impact, it's about the people impact that you might have for the citizens, but also on the interferences that you might generate. So what we did basically is to choose an area, the one which is with the red point, which is an area similar on the right up picture. And then we got some conclusions. I mean, the conclusion we get is that it's clear from our understanding that it's important to work under a collaborative scenario, not only between the private sector, but also with the public sector. I mean, in fact, the deployments also depend, as I said, on the nature of the areas to be covered. So here it's important that we get the support of the administration to facilitate the deployment. Otherwise, you may already know, but there are lots of bureaucracy that needs to be covered. And when you need to go even more dense, things might get even complex. So, as I said, with the exercise of this neutral host approach in Barcelona, that basically I'm at reducing the amount of global infrastructure needed, and also bring a proposal on how to accelerate these deployments. So another important point, however, is the fact that, and it's important to know that the city councils, most of them, I would say, are far beyond of the knowledge of 5G technologies and the infrastructure that are needed. So it means that it creates a big gap between the private sector and the administration, and it might also generate conflicts rather generate collaborations. So this was also one of the proposals that we follow up in Barcelona, creating the 5G Barcelona initiative. So we created an initiative with certain partners, but mostly with the public sector too, with government, with council, collaborating with the private sector on deploying 5G use cases in the city of Barcelona, which in the end is a dense area. But basically to make understand also the city the advantage that 5G might bring, to get closer to the administration to understand the implications that 5G might also need, and also to identify or to show off the importance of the acceptance of these new deployments. However, then if we move to the next slide, please. Let me see if it changes. Okay, here, for example, is one of the conclusions that we found. So we used a scenario, which is the one which is named here 5G coverage, with 14 small cells in a super block. What we call a super block, as I said, is a set of islands of houses of a neighborhood. And then what we did is the work based on a use case example, which you always need to have a use case that is the one that you want to analyze. So, for example, at the beginning, we really deployed the 14 small cell super blocks. We realized that it was not enough to cover the needs, understanding that would be 25 of the people using video streaming simultaneously with high quality, high usage. And then we ended up identifying that maybe for this area, in order to give a premium coverage, which in the end is what people might expect when they get a 5G or they even pay more for the service, is that you need a more specific deployment with analysis on or where we should put the small cells on these blocks. And then indeed, if you go on and you move forward with a scenario which could be maximum coverage with no collaborations between the actors, you realize that it's not going to be to cover a whole city with dense areas because of the problems that might emerge about deploying all these type of infrastructures in all the streets. So then, also to finalize, one of the outcomes that we got is that even though the neutral host could be an approach, rather it's passive, active, here there are many things to discuss, there are things to be considered, which means that important things that the collaboration with the council should facilitate the deployment by using public furniture and infrastructure, as Gilles was already saying. Then there is the need to define what is the role of the city council, and if any, which is not clear, decide if the city council should be a neutral host, if there should be an infrastructure operator to do the role on behalf of the city council. So there are many aspects related to the business models that directly impact on how deployments are done and how they are accelerated. Then there is also a need of a clear regulation scenario to be sure that it's understood by all the players. The building a scenario when you are sharing is not that easy either, because there are different actors that enter into the picture. So here you have facility manager, the neutral host provider, the connectivity provider, the MNOs, spectrum owner, the end user, service provider, content provider, hardware and software providers. So that you end up realizing that every model has the advantages and the disadvantages, and this is something that is what needs to be decided, identified, and promoted. And in the end, as I said, not everything is about technology, but business models behind it. Thank you.
Thank you. That's really helpful insight. And I think as we go forward into the discussion, that sort of how we facilitate and help to get that communication flow between those different actors is something that's going to be really interesting and we should definitely touch on. Okay, we now go to Hans, who's going to give us Ericsson's perspective. Thanks, Hans.
Yeah, thank you very much. So for this purpose, I dusted off a quite old slide, so you can maybe put that one up. Next one, please. Thank you. So if you move to the next slide. Yeah, thank you. I was happy to hear that some of you might recognize this picture on the left-hand side here. So when it comes to small cells, which has been on the agenda for many, many years in previous technologies as well, we looked at the drivers for small cells and how to address capacity needs in urban areas. And then we developed a concept that we call improve, densify, and add. So it's based on the fact that the lowest total cost of ownership is still provided by adding or improving the macro site. So if we look at how this has been developing over the last couple of years, we can see that when it comes to improve macro, a few years ago, when after 4G was launched, started off with like one carrier and quite like simple type of base station to T2R in general. And then we added the 4G 4R, and we also added a new carrier, and then we did carrier aggregation. That gives quite good capacity improvement, up to between 30 to 50% on the existing macro site network. And that's a fairly limited investment from a CSP point of view to get there, basically adding 50% capacity. So that is what CSPs did back a couple of years ago. And then next step, what happened was that 3G was starting to traffic was going down. There was an opportunity to refarm both 2G and 3G spectrum. So that in many cases provided an additional 50 to 100% capacity improvement still on the macro network. So that was also the most cost-effective way to increase the capacity in the network. And now we are looking at 5G deployment. We have seen many CSPs across Europe launching 5G on C-band, so TDD mid-band, also with massive MIMO configurations, antennas. And that is significantly increasing the capacity. So this is additive now. So 30 to 50% capacity improvement in the first step back 5, 6, 7 years ago is a lot less than what 50% more capacity would be today. And with C-band, we are adding 100 to 150%. So we're basically doubling the capacity on the macro network where we deploy C-band. So that's a huge capacity increase. So then the next step to densify macro, that is something that is happening all the time, I would say. Sometimes for coverage purpose, but most of the time when we talk about the urban areas is for capacity increase. To get the site to where you actually have the traffic need and where you have the people to cover. This is this is quite high costly, so a big investment going into this. It usually takes maybe 1 to 2 years to get access and to build the site in urban environment, but still that's a very good return on investment, because you add that capacity that you have on the macro site with all the spectrum assets that you have, you can utilize on the macro site with good power and good coverage. So having been able to add capacity on the macro network over the last couple of years, this has pushed the small cells into the future and ahead of us all the time. Because small cells was really a big discussion 5, 6, 7 years ago. But with the improvements on the macro, it's still like 1 year or 2 years ahead. And I think only future will tell. But we believe that millimeter wave will provide a very good opportunity to build like hotspot capacity where it's needed, when the macro sites are exhausted in terms of spectrum utilization. So this is a generic model that is valid for most CSPs, MNOs. But of course, there are exemptions, and in some places we see more small cell deployment. But I think as a general model, this is what we have seen happening last couple of years. But small cells will be coming, of course. The traffic continue to increase in the past and the near future based on mobile broadband. But in the next 5 years, there will be more traffic growth based on new 5G use cases and more usage of our broadband networks, mobile networks. So in short, or as a summary, C-band macro deployment is definitely growing. It has a large capacity potential still, but small cells will be coming sooner or later. And millimeter wave provides a good opportunity. And we'll see how other frequency bands will be used in small cell deployment as well. So it's that's a bit of what we see in the industry and what are the drivers for small cells. Thank you.
Thanks, Hans. That's very helpful and very clear. I think there's some good stuff for us to pick apart in terms of some of the comments there. So finally, from the summary perspective, we've got Victor, and you're going to give us a TowerCo perspective. So thank you.
Thank you. So hi, everyone. So my name is Victor. I'm the head of the DAS and small cell product line at Cellnex. As Cellnex, we belong also to the European Wireless Infrastructure Association. And if you can go to the next slide, sorry. Yeah, so this is in this association, we've got presence in 14 countries in Europe. We own more than 100,000 sites, telecom tower sites. And at this moment, we are 10 companies. So basically, we are independent, neutral host companies that, as I said, we have presence in Europe. And we are not only deploying towers, we are also deploying small cells, indoor small cells. For example, at Cellnex, we are deploying those as a neutral host for all the MNOs for stadiums, big stadiums like the Etihad and Wanda, but also undergrounds, where is a place where a neutral host, can help to do the deployment easily within all the different parties. Main businesses are, as we said, MNOs, so deploying those infrastructure for the MNOs, but also private networks and IoT. If we move to the next slide, just wanted to show you some of the, let's say, main KPIs here in terms of growth and traffic regarding the mobile operators 4G and 5G. So on the right side of this slide, you can see from the Ericsson Mobility Report the forecast of traffic worldwide in terms of what we call the legacy, 2G, 3G, 4G, and 5G. So you can see that in terms of 5G now in 2022, we are still in a small portion of the total traffic. The traffic in general is increasing, and it's increasing on a CAC of 20 to 30% per year, so every year up to 2026. And the traffic expected in 5G for this 2026 will be around 50 or 60%. We'll have around, let's say, 70% of subscriptions, so 70% of the customers will have a 5G device and a 5G handset and a subscription. In terms of traffic, we will be around this 50%. Okay, and that makes sense on what we've been discussing until now. So MNOs have been deploying these legacy networks, 3G, 4G, especially on the macro sites. Now they are starting to invest on this 3.5 on the C-bands for 5G. And then that will move into the outer small cells for this densification in order to cope with this increase of traffic that we are seeing year over year. On the left side of these slides, I've put you these graphics from the Small Cell Forum, and these are the deployments of small cells, indoor, outdoor, and rural in Europe. So that's only for Europe, and you can see that 30% of those small cells will be deployed in urban areas. Okay, so that means that, as we said, the traffic is increasing, and apart from, on top of deploying more frequencies on the macro sites, something else needs to be done, and that's part of this densification. This is part of the deployment of the small cells. If we move to the next slide. So on this one, it's just to try to explain the neutral host approach. Okay, so you can see on the right side of this slide that the number of participants, let me put it this way, the number of players in this area, especially when we're talking about outer small cells in the city center, is multiple. So we've got the city councils, we've got the street furniture that sometimes belongs to the city council, but sometimes maybe it could be from a different organization. We've got the vendors for providing the telecommunications, the connectivity. We've got also fiber providers to connect those assets. We've got the power companies, sometimes again related to the city council, sometimes could be a third party or a third company that has the concession for that. We've got the citizens, which is important because you know that deploying outer small cells, we will need the acknowledgement of the citizens, especially on this visual impact and trying to let's say to avoid making something that the citizens wouldn't like to have in the center of the cities. And of course, we will have the MNO. So neutral host is positioned in the middle of this ecosystem, and what we try to do is this peace of mind, basically. So we will be the single point of contact. We will deal with the councils, as it was Sergio was saying before. City councils, they don't know about technology, or they don't know about 5G, or they don't know about the capacity increase. So they will be dealing with us. We will be dealing with the MNOs on the best solutions, and what we will be working with all these different partners in order to be the single point of contact. As we were mentioning at the beginning, here there's a TCO issue, there's a cost issue. And I think Hans was explaining this quite well. So MNOs prefer to deploy first in the macro site because it's where they are seeing a better cost-effective solution. And then they will move to the outer small cells. But I think it's our job to try to reduce this TCO as much as possible, trying to get all the parties together, trying to also to regulate this, like the Article 57, for example, from the European Code, which was great in order to open the assets or the access to the assets as much as possible by capping the cost of this. And this is part of our job. Our job also will be on doing this rationalization of the cost by sharing the infrastructure. And sharing doesn't mean to have or it doesn't mean only to have one box shared by 2 or 3 MNOs. So sharing means that we can use that city infrastructure or city assets, and that could be the lamppost, cabinets, or the fiber for more than one MNOs. So at the end, we can deploy, for example, one cabinet, and in that cabinet, we can have 2 or 3 MNOs. And then on the lamppost, we will deploy just the antennas. So in terms, again, going back to that map that we were discussing before, in terms of the citizens, they will see only one antenna. They will not see 2 or 3 boxes, which is something that they don't like. Same for the city council, so they want to avoid this noise. So this is the rationalization that the neutral hosts are trying to provide in this on the densification and the deployment of the outer small cells. So thank you very much, and let's move to the questions if you want.
Thanks, Victor. That's very helpful and very useful summary. So we've got some questions starting to come in, which is brilliant. Please keep them coming, everybody. Maybe, Gilles, I can start with you. And maybe you can give us a sort of flavor of in your, with your work and where you are small cells better for EMF in dense urban area cities, or should we be sticking with macros from that perspective?
Well, in fact, the French Spectrum Agency does lots of EMF measurements because we've been asked to do so because of 5G. Each year, we usually perform about 3,000 measurements across the country, but last year we did 10,000 measurements just to see how 5G was evolving the EMF, and the evolution was very low. In fact, we just published a report about this a few days before in English, by the way. So that provides information. We don't have so much information about 5G small cells, as I said, but what we did was more experimental. We measured experimental small cells in 4G and then in 5G, and what we saw was very good for EMF, because in fact, of course, the small cell is closer to the customer than the macro cell, which is on the top of a building. So the distance is much smaller. So that means that actually the terminal provides less radiation because it's closer, and the small cell also is providing less EMF than the macro cell. So the hot point with EMF is colder. You usually don't have to put a perimeter of security around the small cell because it's low power, whereas you can't actually go on top of the rooftop because of the macro cell. And so the overall result is much better with small cells, but it's very difficult to explain that to people because they see the small cells. So
Yep.
You've got a sort of anti-vax effect. They see the cell, so actually they are suspicious about the small cell, but the overall effect is much better, in fact.
Great, thank you. That's very helpful. Hans, maybe a question for you. We've got from Paolo, and thanks for the questions coming in. There's a lot of discussion, he says, on broadband capacity in terms of megabits per second, but very few discussions on the round trip delays and jitter. So what do you think the target range for 5G could be? Is it 2 milliseconds, 30 milliseconds, or 100 milliseconds? Thank you, Paolo, for that.
Yeah, thank you. That's a good question. I think I mean, mobile broadband in the networks, when we measure today, we see like between 20 to 70 milliseconds, depending on where you are in the network and what time you do some measurements. I think so that's obviously okay for mobile broadband, but it's not going to be fine for all other use cases that we want to do in the 5G network. And I think one important thing here is bounded latency, that we call it, so that you get within maybe 10 to 20 milliseconds, but you get it all the time wherever you are in the network. I think that is maybe more important than getting down to 2 or 3 or 4 or 5 millisecond. Now I talk about end-to-end round trip delay. So in that range, around the 10-20 millisecond is going to be sufficient for most most services that we see. So that's probably a good starting point, and then there will be evolution from that.
Great, thank you. And maybe Sergey, from your perspective, and you were saying that you were looking at the sort of use cases, etc. How do you find from that use case perspective that linking to the Roundtrip and the jitter that we just had the discussion with Hans? How important is it to really get to the very highest performance? And do you need small cells to be able to do that? Or is it something that we can cover from a macro perspective? What use cases do you see developing?
Yeah, well, I mean, there are two types of use cases. I mean, for example, those that you can test in a lab, or those that we have been, for example, testing in the city itself, as we have been doing through the 5G Barcelona initiative. So we have already run maybe around 25 or 30 use cases in the city from different variety. However, and taking into account the current deployment of 5G, which means it's an NSA, and you don't have yet the high performance that the 5G new radio may bring, I have to say that we have not yet faced those strict limitations on those use cases. So whatever we wanted to achieve, validate, has been successfully achieved, obviously because we have prepared all the scenarios, not something that it's a plugin that you go and it's already running. So you need lots of effort. And then you realize how important is that 5G is bringing into the game the whole value chain. So all the use cases that we are doing is because we have the different actors from the value chain of the use case. It's not something that an operator can do by itself, because what you are looking here is not just connectivity. I mean, you need an application. You need an application that is able to be monetized afterwards. You mean the one that is monetizing the content. So you realize that most of the times the complexity comes into putting all the players together to be sure that they are in the same line. And then I totally agree with Hans that for the time being, I mean, understanding again, as I said, for the time being with the infrastructure we have and the current applications, the 10, 20 milliseconds approach, I think it works well. The other thing is that if you want to go to the industry scenario, where you have much more limitations or strict conditions, and then if you want to go to a 5G private network, you might realize that if you want to work on a low-level implementation, you really need these low latencies. But I think that it's a process that 5G is covering different scenarios, different use cases, and different proposals.
Great, thank you. So we have a great question from Branimir. Thank you, from the Commission. He says, how do you assess the impact of the Commission implementing regulation adopted July 2020 on a light deployment regime for small cells? That's in relation to the Electronic Communications Code. Perhaps, Gilles, if I go first to you on that, and then I think, Victor, you might have a view as well.
Yes, thank you. Yes, well, first, I think that this regulation so far did not really have a real impact because it was the first step. But as we said, small cells did not appear so quickly in Europe. The first impact that we had was more on the media side, because when this point appeared in the European Code, in fact, it was a time where fake news in Europe were explaining that with 5G, we were going to have a swarming of 5G poles everywhere in the city, and that would actually kill everybody or so on. So the first impact was that we had to explain that this was not implemented so far. This had to be transposed. In France, we did the transposition, of course, but we made clear that there was a need to keep transparency, because this has to be explained to people, because if they understand that as a sort of you can fire at without decision. You can actually implement the small cells without any control from any regulator. That's a wrong step to take. So it's probably a useful point in the code, but it has to, we must make clear that there will still be control on the small cells, and that people will know where the small cells are. And if this is clear, then it's a useful regulation, but we have to explain it first.
Very helpful. Victor, from your perspective?
Yeah, just to complement, I agree on what Gilles was saying here. So I think Article 57 basically is trying to open the door to the assets. I don't think it makes a big impact if it's a light or it's a medium deployment. To be honest, on the light deployments or small deployments, I think it's helping, because before some of the European cities were going into these big concessions to only one company, and that somehow was implying big deployments for the MNOs or whoever wanted to deploy outdoor small cells. By doing this Article 57, opening the door, so that means that anyone can go to any of those streets assets. And I agree again with Gilles, this needs to be explained, because at the end, the councils or the regulators, they have the word and they can say no on a specific deployment on a potential location in the city, okay, due to different reasons, but one of them could be this visual impact or something like this. So they have the right to say no. But again, I think it's helping on these small deployments for companies that they just want to deploy fewer small cells in a city, in the city center, in the high streets, for example, or in the square in the middle of the city.
That's helpful, thank you. So maybe Sergey, from your perspective, what role should the sort of public sector and cities be playing in this? You know, should they be looking to have a stronger role? Should they be outsourcing it all to one company, the concession model, as Victor said, or should they be managing this more themselves, or in fact letting the operators do what they want? Really interested to hear your perspective of that, particularly given that last question.
Yeah, good. It is a good point, actually. I mean, we have had these discussions largely, right? What is clear is that they have to be part of the game. I mean, they cannot be out of the game. I mean, this is the first point, which sometimes it seems easy, but it's not that easy. Understanding that when you don't have a clear understanding of what role could they have, sometimes you try to avoid them and to go straight forward, right? But as Victor was saying now, I mean, even though that an MNO has rights to deploy, if you have 6 or 5 MNOs in the region, it's not that easy that everybody can access everything. There will be a time issue. It's not clear. Then the other opinion is that the city has a very good understanding of all the city-related issues, as is their job. And also about the procedures, the bureaucracy, that when you enter, for example, we have been deploying also for experimental purposes small cells in lamppost. You not only need to talk to the council has a public company which is doing the deployment, another one which is doing the maintenance, and another one which is accepting the fact that you are stopping a street. So it's a set of actors that need to be related. So they should be a facilitator. The fact that they are no operators, I mean, I don't think that they should properly run the infrastructure, because it's not their purpose. Here we have players like Cellnex that they are full expertise on that. They understand the concept of neutral host. And the idea here, as we were discussing, is what the model should be. Is about a tender that the council makes to facilitate that a neutral host enters into the region under certain conditions, under certain conditions, or it's an agreement without a tender that both commit to achieve the challenge. But as I said, what is clear is that the council needs to be there, but those that experts on managing networks should be the ones operating them, because as I said before, you have passive models, active models. I mean, as Victor was saying, there are many players and it's complex to handle. Nevertheless, this complexity is important that, in my opinion, too also, I mean, that's my thoughts, is like you cannot have many neutral host operators. I mean, it's important that you have one that is leveraging the investment that he's doing, because he has to orchestrate many things in other places. So here also is the role of the big players that they don't go to one area, they go to many areas and they leverage from the experience that they got in one. Thanks.
Great. So given that you need power, you need fiber as well to these, Hans, from your perspective, would you see let's make this as transparent as possible and try different models in different places. And I think we have to facilitate that. But are we going to end up with many different models, or are we going to end up with everything focusing on 2 or 3, do you think, given experience maybe in the US and what's happening? Or do you think you're going to have a very, very diverse set of players that may be different in each city or each municipality?
No, I think, we see quite a diverse situation in different cities and different countries, I would say. And I think the what's happening in the US when it comes to small cells and millimeter wave, I mean, they started off with millimeter wave. We should remember that. There were no C-band when they started. So there was no other option really than start to deploy millimeter wave. And in general, the site-to-site distance in the US is larger than what we see in Europe normally. So small cells is more prevalent in the US for those reasons. When it comes to Europe, we will, as you said, there will be different models. There will be neutral hosts. There will be dedicated operators deploying their own sites. It will be we have an indoor segment that Victor had been talking about, which is quite different from outdoor. Definitely, I agree with Sergey that the collaboration between the municipality and the CSPs is critical here, and the public in general, to remove those hurdles, and then we will see a faster deployment.
Yes, I did think when we were looking at Sergey's, plans of different cities, that Barcelona and maybe the Ramblas is slightly different to LA when you think about how nicely it's laid out as a grid or not. But so really fascinating. I wonder if you would maybe like to comment. There were 2 things that you'd mentioned before about, firstly, that what the impact of verticals might be in this. And secondly, whether small cells have sort of had their time and 3.5's come along and meant that maybe it's not as important as it was a little while ago. I thought there were some interesting comments or thoughts in the last couple of minutes there.
Yes. As I said previously, I think that small cells have to be dissociated between indoor and outdoor small cell. And if we go into indoor small cell, then we can also make another split between verticals and public network, because verticals could actually be, and I think it was in one of the slides presented, could be a good part of small cell deployment, because small cells are very efficient to cover an industry building, for instance, and with some protection from the outside, and it keeps the industry building private. So there's a big potential in deploying small cells in the industry, just to make just for the verticals. I think that's a point where small cells can be implemented quickly. And then the other point was sorry, I forgot it. By the way, there was another question in your question, Andy.
That was whether small cells had, because the millimeter wave in the US had sort of moved quickly because they didn't have 3.5, whether the fact we've now got 3.5 means that small cells have been pushed out a little bit. It's a similar comment to Hans's, actually.
Sorry. Yes, in fact, we could actually discover that maybe the American approach was a dead end. So they started, as was said by Hans, they started with the small cells because they had no mid-band. So they had to do their best on the small cells at a cost. But now they have C-band, and actually C-band can actually take over for the coverage and so on. So small cell deployment is like the infantry, and macro cell deployment is like the Air Force. It's faster, and it provides quick coverage. When you go into infantry, you need, as was said by all the speakers, you need more stakeholders. You need more coordination. It's just like deploying fiber, not deploying macrocells. It's much more complex. So there's probably a need for an ecosystem for small cell deployment, and this ecosystem is going to take some time to build up, to provide, to deliver, in fact, to deliver efficiency and economic efficiency. For the time being, we don't have the troops, so we're still Air Force based, and we do coverage with the macro cells. When there will be time and some expected benefits, then there will be some money put in, and we'll go into small cell deployment. But for the time being, we still have lots to do with the Air Force.
Fantastic. I love that analogy. I think that's a great, difference between being on the ground and the air. Absolutely. I'm conscious that we're just about out of time. I'd like to give any of you a final 10 seconds, 15 seconds, if there's anything that you've learned or anything that has surprised you in the discussion, or anything that you'd like to just sum up on. Hans?
Yeah, no, thank you. No, it was a great session and great discussions and good questions. I just wanted to highlight also that when it comes to millimeter wave, when it eventually will be coming in Europe, in small cells or otherwise, we need to get support in the handsets, in the devices. I think that is thing that is critical. It's already in the devices in the US and some other markets, but they are not yet part of the devices that are sold in Europe, and that needs to happen, of course.
Thank you. That's a good point. Sergey?
Well, as we said as a conclusion, I think that first of all, the driver is the business case, the partnerships, and then the last is the technology, that we know that we can always solve the technology issue, whether it's complex or not. But there should be a huge effort for establishing these new partnerships to work on new 5G ecosystems, because 5G is much more than a network, it's an ecosystem together.
Excellent, I love it. And finally, Victor, the last comment is yours.
Last comment and quick. It's about, so I like to say that this is not about the technology. Technology is there and it's been there for a long time. It's more about connecting the dots, making this process and simplifying this the ecosystem that we were discussing before, trying to make it work in a more efficient way.
Perfect. It's been an absolute pleasure. Thank you all for your input and a great discussion, and thank you to the audience for those questions. And I think we can pass over, possibly only a few minutes late, Dan, but hopefully not too much. Over to you. Thanks for a great session.
We'll let you off a couple of minutes, but we'll let you off. There was definitely lots to discuss, so no problem at all on that. And yeah, another great session. So Andy, thanks to you, and thanks of course to Victor, to Sergi, to Hans, and to Gilles. Really do appreciate that. A great way to wrap things up with this year's conference. So thank you all so much for that, and lots of questions from the audience. So it shows that a good number have stuck with us to the what they sometimes call the graveyard shift, I suppose. But I think the content kept everyone here, which is great. So fantastic. So thank you all so much. So we're done now with the sessions, the panels, but we do still have our conclusory sessions to come. So it's a wrap. Our conclusion session is going to be coming straight up next. So it's a chance for all of our speakers, or not for all of our speakers, for some of our speakers, a selection of our speakers, to give their thoughts and feedback on their key conclusions for the event, and also for all of you out there to add your thoughts and let us know what your key takeaways are. So that's going to be coming up in about 30 seconds. We're just going to shift to a new studio, and we'll be starting with that session then. And don't forget as well, we do have some live music coming up for you as part of that. So yeah, not to be missed. Thank you again to Andy. Thank you to all of our panelists in that session. And as I said, don't go anywhere, and I'll be back here in 30 seconds for the final ceremony. Thanks very much.